You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 291 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. It is New Year's Eve, so happy New Year's to everyone. Hope it's all going well. We made it through 2018, and, for the last show of 2018, the most frequent guest of Foreign Policy Focus, Will Porter. Will is a journalist who writes on, pretty much anything to do with the U.S. empire. His work's been published at antiwar.com. consortiumnews.com. He has a huge archive at the Daily Sheeple. And of course, you can find his work and my work at the Libertarian Institute. My work is featured on the homepage there, the Daily News Roundup, and the show Foreign Policy Focus. URL there is libertarianinstitute.org. Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Happy New Year's, man. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, no problem. Will, thanks for joining me for the show. A little more impromptu on this one than usual, but we got some great red meat from the Washington Post. Josh Rogin, not Joe Rogan, I don't think he would write something this bad, writes on, let's see, the date of this article is December 27th. And welcome to the world of President Rand Paul. So, I don't know, I read that headline and I want to have a celebration. Well, I mean, it doesn't sound like a bad thing to me to have a President Rand Paul, but the vibe of this article is not very happy, that's to say. Rogan complains here that Rand Paul is golfing buddies with President Rand Paul. Of course, something that Rogan points out that I think we agree with is that Trump doesn't seem to have a lot of firm ideology, so he ends up being influenced by whoever has his ear, and it seems that at this time that Rand Paul has his ear. In fact, I think one of the important points that Rogan makes here, and if it's true is a great thing, is that Donald Trump actually decided to withdraw from Syria because of prodding from Rand Paul rather than the phone call with Turkish President Recep Erdogan. Will, what'd you think about this?
Yeah, this definitely, if true, I think is a big thing. A lot of people have been alleging that, it's all about the talks with Erdogan. It's all about the phone call that Trump had with, the Turkish president. But if it was his meetings with Rand, it seems like he's been meeting with him more lately. If this is behind it, then I think that's definitely a good sign. Yeah,
one thing I think this Syria thing has taught me a little bit is that Donald Trump just may not care what his other officials say. I take, statements out of the State Department and like the U.S. envoy to the Syrian conflict and James Jeffrey to reflect the policy of the White House and of Donald Trump. But it turns out that maybe is not just true, and Trump has been a little bit more consistent on the Syria issue. It seems that in April, he kind of gave them 6 months, and now he's saying those 6 months are up. ISIS is defeated, and, we're just leaving. And, this has been the Trump policy. And, whatever the State Department and Inherent Resolve, the Pentagon, the military operation there have put out about kind of this changing mission, this Operation Creep from becoming a war against ISIS to now being, we're going to stay because Iran and Russia is there, and, we have to protect the Kurds and Assad is evil and all this kind of stuff. It turns out to just be out the window. And, Donald Trump's real policy that, we're going to get along with Assad is what's actually, or I guess not what's we're going to get along with Assad, but that we're just going to defeat ISIS and leave. That being the Trump policy is what it is.
Yeah, I think it's easy to sort of underestimate just how big the gap is, just how big this chasm is between Trump and his staff and his personnel. Because you see, when Tillerson was still in charge, was still Secretary of State, you remember him going out and giving that big speech where he's talking about a long-term presence in Syria and, to combat Iran and all this kind of stuff. And it doesn't, that seems a world away from the thinking of the president. The president, as you said, in April came out and said at a rally, sort of seemingly spontaneously, came out and said, hey, we're getting out of Syria very soon. And, his commanders were able to convince him, the generals were able to convince him to stay 6 more months. But yeah, it's interesting just to look at how big the difference is between Trump and the people around him. And maybe going forward, don't be fooled by if you see a statement from one of his people saying something more hawkish, perhaps that's not actually the direction that we're heading in.
Now, in this article, Rogin mainly talks about Syria, and we'll get into the Syria stuff in a minute, but he mentions Afghanistan as another area where Rand has had influence. And, I remember when Rand voted for Pompeo for State Department, Secretary of State, he did so with the, I guess, insurance or guarantee from Donald Trump that we would be leaving Afghanistan. And so then, I guess, first of all, maybe we see some consistency with the Trump policy here, that, he did agree, with all the generals to give it a try, but now that it's not working. And, he made this guarantee to Rand Paul that we would leave, and, we're at least drawing down on troops in Afghanistan. He also, Rogin just kind of says in an offhand remark, what is troop withdrawal from North Korea next? So, Will, I don't know if you have anything to weigh in with there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could certainly hope so. I think our view of that, that possibility is a little different from Rogan's, though.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, these are things that we would love to see, where Rogin is saying like, oh my God, we might leave Afghanistan. He points to, like, he calls Rand Paul a liar and says that Rand Paul is a guy with his own facts. And he points out certain criticisms of Rand Paul. One is he says that Rand Paul, kind of falsely believes that the GOP hawks in America created ISIS and led to the rise of the Islamic State and, supported Al-Qaeda in Syria. And then for his proof of this is that Rand Paul had a kind of backtrack on his claim that, the United States, that John McCain met with ISIS. And, I'm sure everybody remembers this meme where, like, somebody was circled in a red circle and is like bad daddy. This claim that McCain was me with the leadership of ISIS, turns out not to be true. So, Will, why don't you kind of tell us what happened with this whole ISIS meme? Cause I think it is important to remind our listeners, cause I even see it occasionally floated around, by people that I think are listeners of the show now. And then we could talk more generally about how much the U.S. has supported Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria.
Yeah, there's like a couple versions of this meme or this image where, as you say, it's like Senator John McCain with a group of dudes, a group of Syrian guys, and one of the guys is circled and it says, "This is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi." And this kind of goes around like conspiracy circles a lot, especially like right-wing conspiracy circles. And it's simply not true. That guy they circle is not Baghdadi at all. The guys that McCain actually met with there are members of what's called the Northern Storm Brigade. And they were like aligned or linked with what's called the Free Syrian Army. And that's supposed to be the moderate faction of the Syrian resistance. However, as I think we've talked about on the show often, the Syrian resistance, including the Free Syrian Army, has not been moderate. I believe the Northern Storm Brigade was at least suspected of selling journalist Steven Sotloff to the Islamic State. So they were involved in this kind of human trafficking stuff. They were not good guys. And McCain, was meeting with them. And so, Rand was wrong that it was ISIS, but nonetheless, it's still kind of, if you dig into this question, who are these people in this image? It kind of touches on how, the nature of the opposition in Syria and that kind of stuff.
Right. So I guess, next we could get into, Rand's claims, that Rogin just dismisses, that the United States, in the hawks in our country advocated for policies that led to the rise of the Islamic State and the Al-Qaeda resistance to Assad in Syria, which is different. I want to link to in the show notes page and suggest my listeners check out an article in Consortium News by Max Blumenthal titled something similar to, the loudest critics of Trump's Syria policy are those that helped, the policy that fueled the Islamic State. But in that article, Max really goes through and points out how people like John Kerry, Samantha Power, Hillary Clinton advocated for policy where we gave weapons to the armed resistance to Assad, and these guys become Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It's a great article. It's a great breakdown. I'll link to that in the show notes page, but now I'll kick over to Will Porter to, kind of explain everything else to us here in audio.
Yeah, I hope your audience is now familiar with this sort of story. You know, the broad strokes of how George W. Bush invaded Iraq, empowered Al-Qaeda there, you know, Sunni militants there. The group under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi is the group that became the Islamic State, who's now under Baghdadi. And then Obama sort of doubled down on this crazy policy by arming the Syrian opposition, who, you know, a lot of those arms ended up going to groups like ISIS and ISIS itself. And so, yeah, it's interesting, you know, as Blumenthal says, a lot of the very same people who are, you know, the same people who would call Rand Paul a liar for saying these kind of things are the very ones who supported the policies that he's talking about. So that's funny.
Right. You know, I'll just add here that, you know, we have these Free Syrian Army guys, like groups like Dinor al-Zinki or just other FSA groups like al-Nusra, who enforce Islamic law to the point where they kill children. You know, this little Palestinian boy isn't the right kind of Muslim, so they cut his head off. This kid makes a crack about Muhammad, a little kid street vendor, they shoot him in the head. And, you know, that's kind of the law that they enforce. And so, you know, I guess, you know, Rogin could say that, you know, these guys aren't Al-Qaeda, so Rand Paul is a liar. But okay, if we just look at the policy that, you know, we're shooting people who are, you know, we're supporting people who, you know, kill people who don't enforce this kind of strict Islamic law, these are the people that we're supporting in Syria. So whether they're technically Al-Qaeda or not, I don't know. But, you know, certainly that broad brush title of, you know, we're supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria seems more or less to be correct to me. Now, he also says that Rand Paul falsely claims, a little bit more specifically, that we're flying as Al-Qaeda's Air Force in Syria. So do you want to talk, Will, a little bit how U.S. air support really helped the Al-Qaeda resistance to Assad?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, in addition to the sort of arm and train programs under Timber Sycamore, under Obama's CIA, of just giving weapons and training to rebels, certainly the U.S. has flown air support for the rebels. For the rebels, excuse me. There's also several cases in which the U.S. government bombed Syrian forces specifically, or Syrian militia allied forces who were then at that time fighting the Islamic State. And there was actually another case where the U.S. pulled back and refrained from bombing Islamic State convoys, sort of because it would have threatened the Syrian state. And so there's a lot of ways in which the U.S., you know, either by, you know, helping the rebels bombing or refraining from bombing ISIS in certain key times, has sort of helped. And, you know, as Rand Paul said, flown as their air force in effect.
Right. I saw somebody posting on Twitter today the video. It's an Obama, I believe, State Department official, in a press conference briefing, and there's a journalist straight up asking him that, you know, I think it's the story you're talking about, the situation with Palmyra, Syria. It was kind of famous because ISIS destroyed a lot of very ancient and very, you know, kind of important historical, archaeological, like, different sites there. But you had ISIS crossing an open desert and the United States choosing not to attack them in this situation. So minimal civilian casualties. It's an easy open target. And we choose not to because we want them, Assad and his forces, to take a loss in Palmyra, so they lose to our, you know, U.S. bad forces in Aleppo. And, you know, the journalist asked the representative, is this the U.S. policy in Syria? And, you know, the U.S. official is kind of like, oh, well, and tries to kind of play it off and just doesn't answer the question. But, you know, here's the case where we openly admit that, you know, our Air Force did not attack ISIS in Syria at the detriment of the Assad government. So who is our Air Force helping there?
And let me just add, too, you know, this is all very consistent with what you can hear John Kerry saying in that leaked recording when he's met with those Syrian opposition activists, talking about how, you know, we saw that the Islamic State was threatening Assad and we thought we could manage. And so, yes, this was U.S. policy to sort of allow the Islamic State progress where we thought it would hurt Assad. And so, yeah, we definitely, in various ways, helped them.
So I think the most dangerous part of the article, Will, here is right at the end, which is Rogan's prescription to Donald Trump. He says, hey, Trump, you got an election coming up in 2020. Having this Rand Paul guy telling you your foreign policy is very dangerous because the American people, they support a robust foreign policy. And, you know, Rand Paul says the Americans are on his side with bringing the troops home, but if you look at the actual facts in the polling, which Rogin doesn't provide any actual polling results here that was suggested, but he says that Americans support the robust foreign policy. So, you know, I guess, you know, Will, we can't know what's in everybody's head and what people actually support. I'm sure my Twitter feed isn't representative of the nation as a whole. But what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, like, as you pointed out to me off air, the districts that voted for Donald Trump are some of the ones where I think enlisted men come from in the heaviest concentrations. That was the figure, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that itself is pretty illustrative about, what the American people want here. Who's voting for this guy who says he wants to get us out of these conflicts? I think you can sort of massage polling data, depending on who you ask and how you phrase the questions. And there have been polls that showed that 60% or 58% of Americans support a no-fly zone on Syria or things like that. But again, I think that poll data can sort of be massaged in one direction or another. And things like, the fact that Trump went right in front of a deep South audience and denounced the Iraq War as being based on lies in an attack on Jeb Bush, and how that didn't harm him. He won. He did well in that area. So I think that itself is also pretty illustrative too, but just anecdotally about the feelings of the American people toward these conflicts and toward a robust foreign policy, as Rogin calls it.
Right. I mean, the last, 5, 6, 7 U.S. elections, it was the less hawkish president that won every single one of them. I mean, Obama was clearly less hawkish than Romney and McCain. I don't know Bush versus Edwards, but certainly Bush versus Gore, he was saying no nation building. Not that Gore was necessarily a hawk as well, but, these pro-peace campaign issues do work. And so Donald Trump, if you want to, win, don't listen to Josh Rogin. He's the poison guy. Rand Paul is your man.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, if you remember, George W. Bush, I think, ran on a humble foreign policy. And so there's another case.
All right. So now I want to get into Will a little bit here. Some other news stories of the day. We have this group of vets, 50,000, I believe, in total, filing a class action lawsuit with one of the Ivy League schools. Basically, I guess it would be against the Pentagon or the government, saying that their less than honorable discharges are unfair because, it came as a result of, PTSD or a related issue they got on the job. I remember back in the early 2000s, well, I guess the mid 2000s and late 2000s, it got to be a very big deal that you had all these young men and women going and serving multiple tours. So they go, they're back for 3 months, they go again, they're back for a few months, they go again, they're back for a few months. Well, over the course of time, they come home, they get involved with drugs, or they, get in a domestic abuse situation, and then they get less than honorable discharge from the military. And so now they don't qualify for benefits and a whole bunch of other stuff. And, I think this is just one of the best examples to me of how much, the politicians glorify and, really use the military to say hey, this is the reason we need to stay in all the wars. But then when they have the opportunity to actually do something, here, providing more care to vets, that they just don't do it. Past examples, Gulf War syndrome, Agent Orange, burn pit victims are kind of a current example of this. I mean, I'm guessing you kind of agree with that, Will.
I mean, yeah, certainly. I think, our soldiers are often, as you said, used as sort of the justification for these things. Hey, you got to support the troops. You got to always fund the wars and, vote to fund the wars. But, when it comes down to it, they're extremely disposable and, they're not taken care of. I talked to you on this show about my article on how veterans kill themselves at alarming rates, at way more than any other sort of demographic in the population. And the programs to care for this or to sort of address this phenomenon are non-existent, from the Department of Veteran Affairs, excuse me. They've barely done anything. And so indeed, I think, our veterans and our soldiers, our active duty soldiers are often disposable and treated, with real disregard. Right.
It's always amazing here. I have this other story. The State Department just approved a $400 million contract to Boeing for, I think, service to engines on the B-1 and B-52 bombers, right? And so here you have an example. The new acting Secretary of Defense is a longtime Boeing executive, Patrick Shanahan, and then Boeing gets a $400 million contract. Now, I'm sure they are going to get it anyways, and this is one of those things where, we've had these bombers forever, so it's probably cheaper to continue to service the engines rather than make new ones. But do you think there's enough scrutiny being paid at the Pentagon when the boss's former company is the one receiving the contract? Do you think anybody's looking at trying to negotiate them down to $300 million, $200 million? That way they could take that other money and provide it to more, mental health services for veterans who are just killing themselves at unbelievable rates. No, that's not what happens. They just, continue to award those contracts, and nobody even raises the question, wait, the new Secretary of Defense is a longtime executive of Halliburton or of Boeing, and sorry, Dick Cheney in my brain. And then, they're awarding these contracts, and there's not massive oversight. Shouldn't Josh Rogin be writing articles on that? Making sure that every line of that $400 million is absolutely needed money?
Right. I mean, yeah, for this particular deal, maybe it was already on the books or something. I don't know all the details about it, but it certainly looks really bad when you have this, former, Boeing guy in there overseeing this kind of stuff. But hopefully that kind of thing, it's not probably going to in Josh Rogan's case, but hopefully that does draw more scrutiny from people to comment on this. It's a pretty bad look there. It's a pretty pretty glaring kind of conflict of interest, I guess.
Right. And I'm not saying that this particular arms contract is, there's anything wrong with it. You know what I mean? Because it's so hard to know that, these contracts come by all the time, $400 million for this, a couple billion for that project. And who knows what the end final price actually is on them. It's just, with the current situation and this new, acting Secretary of Defense, there seems to be a lot more, scrutiny over this. Now, I'm guessing part of the reason, Will, is just the government kind of just acts on its own momentum at this point. And so you have things in the House that happen where, in a high school civics class, I learned that every bill is debated and everybody votes on every bill. But really what happens is the House passes 15, different bills in a day, and they don't do a recorded vote on every one. They're just all yays and nays, and that's all it is. And I guess Representative Massey is quite upset that the House leadership is preventing a actual vote on the U.S. support for Saudi Arabia and their genocidal war in Yemen. And so he's forcing a voice vote on all these different recorded vote, on all these different bills. So everybody has to actually attach their name to voting for these bills. And they probably do anyways, but it also takes more time, and it means that more members actually have to be present in the chamber of the House. So really just forcing the different representatives to do their job, but apparently is creating quite a stir on Capitol Hill. There are many representatives who are not very pleased with what they see as antics from Representative Massey.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add there, but that's it's good to see his efforts there.
Right. It's one of those things that it's great because either the representatives can't complain and they have to be miserable. And so I like miserable warmongers, or they do complain and it just exposes them as frauds. They can't even do their job. It's great. Moving over to Europe, we have a couple stories, very important to Germany. First is that, I think the president of the EU, but some person in leadership over there, gave a statement saying that they're moving forward with the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This is a pipeline that's going to be bringing energy into Europe from Russia. It'll greatly increase the capabilities from, the Nord Stream pipeline that is currently bringing a small amount of, I believe, liquefied natural gas into Germany. The U.S. has stood opposed to this. We've created sanctions against Russia that I think technically apply to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, different sanctions saying that countries can't do business with certain Russian energy companies or companies that improve Russia's ability to do energy business around the world. But Europe, I guess, is saying that, we don't care anymore and is going to move ahead with the construction of this pipeline. Another story coming out of Germany here is we have Germany looking to expand the number of permanent member states on the Security Council. These are really the most powerful members at the UN. It's currently limited to 5, the US, UK, France, China, and Russia. Germany would like to see that expanded. Countries that have also suggested they should be on the Permanent Security Council include Australia, India, a country with a population of 1 billion. Brazil sees themselves as a country that should be there, because of, they're being kind of the largest in South America. In Africa, different countries have proposed having a permanent seat, either like maybe a permanent seat for Africa that rotates between countries, or Nigeria or South Africa, taking possible bids. So, Will, I mean, this certainly seems to me to be something worth paying attention to, just because, as much as I don't believe in world government, there is one, and the Security Council permanent members do have a lot of power. So, we certainly see this kind of changing the way world power works, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it would be sort of good to decentralize more of this power and to spread it out among more nations and give other nations a say. I mean, it kind of seems unfair on the face of it that, like, only it's called the P5+1, only 6, countries. Germany, I guess, is sort of added on in a special way. It's not an official member or something. I'm not sure how that works. However, I mean, I think it would definitely be good to decentralize this. There's a lot of countries in the developing world who are becoming sort of economic, at least regional economic players in their own right. And yeah, perhaps they do deserve a say in some of these deliberations. A lot of what the Security Council decides on are typically pertains to countries who are not part of the P5+1. So maybe we should give some of them a say.
Moving into Syrian news. We have the city of Manbij switching hands. It's now in the hands of the Syrian Arab Army. This came as Turkey was threatening to invade and the U.S. was withdrawing. It seems like the YPG, the Syrian Kurds, are now making deals with Russia, and we're starting to see Syrian forces flow into Kurdish-held areas. Will, I mean, it's hard to evaluate what the long-term consequences will be here, which is why me and you always advocate a non-interventionist policy to deal with. But it does seem that this is maybe the path of, the least amount of dead bodies or fighting right now, rather than Turkey invading and you have a lot of fighting between Turkey and Kurdish forces. You're going to have the Syrian army take over, and hopefully, Russia will be able to mediate between Turkey and the Assad government, to prevent any cross-border fighting there. And we could start to see, this seems to me to be a step towards the end of the Syrian civil war.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have definitely not been alone among, geopolitical analysts in sort of our conclusion that the American relationship with the Kurds in Syria, of backing them and giving them weapons and stuff and embedding with them, could not go on indefinitely. We, of course, had concerns that we would try to do it indefinitely in relation to that plan to combat Iran and Iranian influence and all that. But it was pretty clear that at some point the United States was going to sort of, backstab or abandon the Kurds here. And, it was likely that was going to leave them in a precarious position with all this territory they've captured and they're holding, sitting on right now. A lot of that is Arab territory that, there might be some sort of unrest in some of those towns and villages. It's sort of it's a powder keg here. And the Kurdish, sort of overtures and the agreements, the security deal they've made with Assad and Russia, that's really promising. I think that really kind of precludes the possibility of like a massive Turkish, all-out assault and slaughter on the Kurds. It sort of puts Assad between the Kurds and the Turks. And that might make an all-out assault less likely, especially if Russia's involved there. If Russia, is going to get involved in that spat. I think Turkey is going to be a lot more averse to invade. And so they might still do something, but yeah, this is definitely a good sign.
Another sign that I think is kind of suggesting that we're seeing closer to the conclusion of the end of the Syrian civil war here is the UAE and Bahrain, I guess, is going to be the next country to announce, is kind of reestablishing normal diplomatic relations with Assad. Of course, these are countries that provided a lot of backing to the Sunni resistance to Assad. And so, previous enemies of the government now starting to reconcile and moving forward. I want to mention, and I'll link to this in the show notes page, it's something that, you'll have to watch. It's a video. Jane Ferguson with the PBS NewsHour takes a trip to Yemen. She did this a few months ago and did a great 3-part series, like kind of exposing the U.S. role in the Yemen war and then the humanitarian crisis. This time she looks at the humanitarian crisis in Yemen and just does an excellent job showing the children there, the conditions that they're living in, how poor and terrible it is. And I think this is the kind of thing that hopefully will get people to realize the U.S. really needs to be out of this war, because the images are just undeniable. that this is a war against the civilian population of Yemen, and the children are literally starving and dying to death from it.
Yeah, it's really good to see the Western press covering this more. You know, the Yemen war went on for years without much coverage at all. I think it was MSNBC went a whole year without covering it at all on TV. They covered Stormy Daniels, 100 or 1,000 times or something, but not Yemen once. And so, yeah, I think especially since like the Khashoggi killing and all this, there's been a sort of renewed attention being paid now to Yemen, and that's good.
All right, there's a few stories I want to touch on in Africa. In the Congo, you had voting for a new president in that country. One of the issues here is that voting was postponed in areas where there's an active cholera outbreak. There's a city of 1 million with some people contracting cholera there now. Of course, this current outbreak has killed 350 and infected about twice that number. There was those protesters going through and actually ransacked an Ebola treatment facility, and the patients fled. Now, 24 people fled. 17 were, came back to the center and tested negative, for Ebola. But there were 7 people yet to be tested, the last I read. So I just want to kind of update on that story because, I think that Ebola outbreak is starting to gain a little bit more mainstream attention. And the important thing to remember here is, of course, there's a lot of fighting going on in that area, which is really prolonging the Ebola outbreak there, preventing aid workers from doing anything about it. In Nigeria, you had Boko Haram seizing a village and a military base from the Nigerian government. This is an area of Africa where the United States is increasingly saying we have to worry about terrorism. And although we may have a small drawdown of U.S. ground forces in Africa, we have, just an increasing, drone presence in that country. And so if you start to see more and more militant groups attack and take territory from, the internationally recognized governments of these countries, one, it could cause them to turn to the United States and receive more military support. So you see more brutal crackdowns on people like we saw in the Middle East. But also you just see more U.S. drones flying overhead and possible, targeted attacks. Last story in Africa I want to touch on. We had this bus bombing. A tourist bus kills 3, I think, Vietnamese tourists and then the driver of the bus near the pyramids of Giza there. And then subsequent military raids by the Egyptian security forces. So I'm sure pretty thuggish people end up killing 40 militants. I didn't read that anybody was captured. So this is kind of alarming to me that you have so many people dead in what should be internal military raids in Egypt, I would guess captured, right? 40, you would think a couple people would end up turning themselves in or not get, killed, just wounded in the gunfight or something like that and later captured. But this story going on, I think one illustrates, kind of the instability in Egypt that we've seen. Of course, there was, within 2018 in the past year, there was that massacre of Sufis, out in the Sinai Peninsula, like 200 people shot up. That was absolutely disgusting and tragic. But this event now, and you had these like very broad crackdowns by, the Egyptian police and just killing militants, and who knows who these people really are. All right, well, I guess that's where we'll wrap up the show for today. Thank you for joining me on today's show with somewhat late notice and helping me to break down that Josh Rogin article. It's always fun to get to talk about Rand Paul doing good things in the Senate there. Will, do you have anything else to add for my audience?
No, I just I had fun smashing the Washington Post as we often do.
All right,
that's about it.
Patreon, Twitter, tell everybody where to find you.
Yeah, so if you want to support me, you can find me at patreon.com/WKPjournalist. And on Twitter, my handle is WKPANCAP, ANCAP. And on Facebook, you can find me as Will Porter. I forget what my URL is on there, but it shouldn't be too hard to find. And you can read me at the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, the Daily Sheeple, Consortium News, etc., etc.
All right, for the show, libertarianinstitute.org, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, Twitter at KYAAALE, Minds.com, the new crypto social network site. I'm at Immersion News there. And of course, Immersion News is the name of my news website. So check that out as well. Thanks for tuning in.